Good morning. Welcome to this next session here on World Sustainable Procurement Day 2024. My name is Jo Parkin. I am the co-chair of the UK chapter here at SPP. I am joined this morning by my another member of our core team of the UK, by Will Ennett, and three fantastic speakers. And we've got a great discussion coming up for you over this next hour on how to consider nature and biodiversity in your supply chain. Next slide, please. Here are your three speakers that we have. We have got Ross Primmer, Marina Bradford, and Emma Howcroft. They'll be talking to you about all aspects of nature and biodiversity, starting with some of the basics and then some really practical explanations of how we can actually consider this within our supply chain, and Emma with her examples of how she's actually been going on this journey already. Here at SPP, we're building a community. So if you like what you see here today at WSPP, then please join us. We'll put the links in the chat if you haven't already signed up to become one of our ambassadors. Just before we begin, we'll just go through a couple of points for you. Next slide. So just before we get going, just to remind everybody, we will be recording this session this morning. It will be available, all of the sessions on this 24 hours of World Sustainable Procurement Day will be available for you free for the next 2 weeks, but we also then have them on our own SPP YouTube channel for all our recordings. Please use the tools to interact. We do want to hear from you this morning. I know it's early, but please do put your questions or comments in the chat box on your functionality on the right-hand side of your screen. Also, we ask you to spread the word. This is for procurement by procurement. We talk about how to be practical and upskill ourselves and our teams so that we can all be faster and collaborate together to accelerate our progress that we are making. We'll give you other links to sign up in the chat box if you haven't already done so. So without further ado, let's get started on this morning's session. I'm going to hand over, first of all, the format this morning. Each of our three fantastic speakers are going to just introduce themselves, talk a little bit about nature and biodiversity, and then we will have some questions and answers as well during this session and a full discussion. So please do post your questions in the chat and we will come to them. We have plenty of time allowed for that this morning. Okay. Thank you. Okay, Ross, over to you. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jo. So my name's Ross Primmer. I'm a senior consultant with Action Sustainability and Supply Chain Sustainability School. So we're a kind of free at point of use, I guess, kind of resource for the construction sector. Looking forward to speaking to you in a minute. So I have to quickly hand over to Marina then to introduce herself before we start.
Thank you very much. My name is Marina Bradford. I'm a director and a founder at consultancy Bemari. We work with organizations to help understand their environmental footprint, build strategies for reduction, and go along that journey. I'm also a committee member at the UK Business for Biodiversity Forum, which supports businesses across the board to integrate nature and biodiversity into their supply chain practices.
And hi everyone, I'm Emma Howcroft. I'm the Global Sourcing Sustainability Director at Avantor Sciences, a life sciences company, and I'm responsible for leading our sustainable sourcing strategy. Lovely to see you all. Back to you, Ross.
Thanks, Emma. Will, can I have next slide, please? And the next one, please. So just before we kind of get going, I just wanted to give some really kind of basic introduction to what biodiversity is, because I know some of the kind of definitions can get confused. So when we talk about a species, we're basically talking about a type of plant or animal. So on your screen now you can see a European badger. That is a species. It's a particular organism that kind of lives in the UK and Europe. And badgers, they live within habitats, and a habitat is kind of the environment in which a particular animal lives. So, badgers live in the woods. And then an ecosystem is where we just start to talk about the kind of interactions between species in their habitats. So, for example, within a woodland habitat. You know, badgers, they fulfill a function. They disperse seeds. They kind of actually they're foragers, so they kind of look for kind of various things to eat and that kind of thing, and they form part of this system that then kind of links together, and in theory it can sustain itself over time. And then biodiversity is the term that we use to describe either the kind of number or diversity of life within an ecosystem. So deciduous woodland, where a badger lives, is a very biodiverse habitat. There's lots of species within it. And we can actually also use the term biodiversity to describe the kind of diversity within a species as well. So if a species is highly biodiverse, there's lots of genetic diversity within it, and that can help with things like kind of adaptation to climate change. You know, if there's a change in the environment and there's more genes in that particular species to kind of adapt to that change. Next slide, please, Will. And then I think one of the things I really wanted to get over in my part of this presentation is just the connectivity between different species within a habitat. So this is a very simple kind of GCSE level diagram that shows a food web. And within that food web, we can see this kind of interrelationship between different species, you know. And then within that, there are some species that maybe you could say are more important than others. You know, if the grass wasn't there, the whole ecosystem wouldn't exist. But, you know, one of the things that increasingly we're understanding from a scientific perspective is we don't really understand the complexities fully of all of these interactions. So, you know, if we were to remove one, who knows what the kind of impact in the long term might be. And that's essentially what's happening now, because we're seeing lots of declines in species, but altering these kind of complex interactions between species as humans. And this is then creating the biodiversity declines that we're seeing globally. Next slide, please, Will. And actually, this interconnectedness of everything is not just about kind of, you know, everything we see if we go on a nice walk somewhere. Well, when we're in nature, the humans are as much part of biodiversity as anything else. And there's just a few examples on your screen now. You know, if we think about, you know, the kind of food resources that we consume, you know, wild caught fish is probably one of the only kind of wild sources of protein. Well, it's actually one of the biggest sources of protein in the world, and one of the only kind of wild things that we truly kind of still eat if you eat fish as a human. But it's not just the wild caught food, it's also you know, kind of industrial agriculture is entirely reliant on biodiversity to function. You know, if you think about just the growing of crops, even when you're looking at kind of genetically modified organisms, which is another another kind of discussion for a different day. You know, when we're looking at splicing genes into crops to make them more productive and that kind of thing, we still need to get them from somewhere and rely on biodiversity for that. And you know, without the kind of diversity of life that we have, you know, we'd really struggle to kind of feed ourselves, or we wouldn't be able to. You know, when we look at the kind of various processes that kind of exist on the planet, you know, if we think about the water cycle, if we think about the phosphorus cycle, we think about the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, you know, it could go on. All of these systems have, to a degree, are reliant on biodiversity. And without these systems, you know, we wouldn't have clean air, we wouldn't have productive soils, we wouldn't have fresh water, we wouldn't have all the things that we rely on really to survive on this planet. You know, we're also reliant on biodiversity for kind of, I guess, the more kind of intangible aspects of kind of health and well-being. You know, I think, you know, it's interesting now, you know, if you go to Japan, they call it forest bathing. You know, you go into the forest and it kind of makes you feel better. You know, the NHS is now even looking at trying to provide sort of green prescriptions where, you know, encouraging people to go out into nature and actually kind of, you know, it's beneficial for their mental health and people's well-being. You know, and when we look at kind of resources, if we look at the kind of physical things that we need, from, you know, the clothes that we wear to the timber that's in our houses to the, like I say, the food that we eat, so kind of even the drugs that we kind of need within our healthcare systems, to a degree, you know, biodiversity is an absolutely fundamental part of these things and actually kind of sustaining the way that we live on Earth today. And then also, I think perhaps uniquely as well, as humans, you know, we have this ability to have a positive or negative, make a decision to have a positive or negative impact on the biodiversity around us. So, you know, we have a decision, you know, for example, in the construction sector where I've done a lot of work, where, you know, we can choose to create environments within the construction site that are biodiversity. We can choose to use native species. We can choose to look at things like biodiversity net gain to make sure that we have a kind of positive impact on biodiversity when we leave a site. And on the flip side, we can also kind of choose to have a negative impact as well. I'm just going to go into it. I don't want to make this all negative, but I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail in my next slide. So next slide, please, Will. So I think one of the reasons why we're really talking about biodiversity now is we are seeing some quite significant declines globally. And there was a recent report by the WWF called the WWF Living Planet Report, which kind of really picked out 5 reasons for this. The first one being changes in land and sea use. So this is where we're kind of humans are taking relatively wild areas, so it could be a piece of tropical rainforest, it could be some short grassland in the UK, and we're changing the land use. So we're changing it from a kind of relatively natural state, which is highly biodiverse or important to biodiversity, to something that is more, urbanized or, clear felling trees for agriculture and that kind of thing. That results in a degradation of the habitat and a reduction in the biodiversity that's there. We're also quite good at over-exploiting species as well. I think one of the things, if we think about, I guess, biodiversity from a more sort of a human commercial perspective, is it's potentially one of the most sustainable resources that we have. If we think about fish stocks or we think about timber resources, if we consume them at a rate which they can regenerate, then they will last forever. Unfortunately, as humans, we're quite good at exploiting things for short-term gain and maybe long-term pain. And, now we're seeing big declines in, for generations, we've seen declines in fish stocks. And, obviously, there's big reductions in some of the big kind of forests in the world. We're over-exploiting these resources at a rate that's faster than they can regenerate. Invasive species is another really key one. If we think about essentially through global trade and various kind of movements of people and products and all that kind of thing, we introduce species from different parts of the world into other parts of the world. If we go back to thinking about those food webs that I talked about a couple of minutes ago, if you introduce a species to an environment where it wasn't there before, it can outcompete what was natively there, and then you have a kind of degraded food web or ecosystem because the species has no competitors and outcompetes everything. If we think about pollution, we've also we're quite good as a kind of a species at introducing contaminants to the air, to the land, and to the sea, which have a negative impact on biodiversity. It could be, for example, like heavy metals or potentially pesticides, fertilizers, effluents from industry. This then results in mortality and kind of a direct loss of biodiversity. And then, one that I'm sure you're all familiar with, climate change is a really, really kind of key issue for biodiversity as the planet changes and the speed of how it's changing. Species either need to adapt to this change. If they can move. Unfortunately, there are increasing situations where habitats are kind of on little islands around areas of human development and that kind of thing, and it's harder for species to adapt to climate change, especially if we have migratory species and all these kind of things, and that's also resulting in species mortality, harder for species to survive, increased stress as well, and that makes it harder for species to reproduce, and then a reduction in biodiversity. So next slide, please. And this is just one example that I read the fact and I kind of had to do a double take on it. I just wanted to really quickly highlight it. Something that probably you don't really think about, but this is just a piece of research that was done by Imperial College in London. And essentially what it's showing you is that one treatment of flea treatment for an average size family dog, there's enough insecticide in that to kill 25 million bees. And we don't really think about that. I'm sure you kind of, if you've got a pet, you may well have done this. You've got your dog, you treat your dog, it goes and jumps in the river, and obviously over time that washes into the streams and affects insect life. And when we times that with dogs in the UK, and then we kind of consider, well, why are we seeing these massive declines in biodiversity? It's one thing, it's a tiny thing. I appreciate it's maybe a little bit a tricky one if you do have a pet, but I think it just highlights the fact that we really need to think about what we're buying and the potential impacts that it might have. Next slide, please. And then this is just, again, some numbers from the WWF about biodiversity declines worldwide since 1970. Just to highlight the fact, we are in a biodiversity emergency at the moment. You hear a lot about the climate emergency, but the biodiversity emergency is just as relevant. And, you can see, in South America, we've seen 94% diversity since loss in biodiversity since 1970. Obviously, that's one of the most biodiverse and pristine parts of the world, with things like the Amazon rainforest. In Central Europe, we've seen 24%, but then arguably most of our biodiversity loss in Europe happened way before 1970. So obviously we need to, just to really highlight the fact that it is an emergency situation, and we really need to kind of readdress some of the declines that we've seen. Next slide, please. Yes.
In the interest of time, I know it's fantastic. We're going to move on to Marina.
Okay.
We've got time for the discussion. So if you could just sort of move forward just a couple of slides, please. Thank you. We will get Ross back on. We will do other UK sessions with regard to more detail, etc., following this event as well. Marina, over to you so we can have time for the discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to try and just pick off where Ross has left and talk to you about why we should really care. So if you can move us to the next slide, please. First of all, just for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of planetary boundaries, a reminder of the urgency. Planetary boundaries are the boundaries of our ecosystem that we need to have a stable life and a stable ecosystem within which we can, as humanity, thrive, but ultimately as the nature around us can also be in balance. And that is the green space you see here. The scientists from the Stockholm Resilience Institute have been doing this research for quite a number of years, and the last year have told us that we have now breached 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries. But I want you to draw your attention to the fact that climate change is the one that we often talk about, but it is not the one that has been overshot the most. Biodiversity, and if you just can click for us, please, Will, is actually the one that is the most pressing at this point in time, and that is the foundation for the rest of the components and the different ecosystem balances. When we have gone into this really dark purple space even further, we just don't know what's going to happen as the ecosystem start collapsing and we start having various events and issues that we don't know how to deal with. If you can move to the next slide, please, we can also start seeing that actually the business leaders are starting to recognize this. And in the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, which runs every single year, we can start seeing what kinds of risks the businesses are thinking about and are foreseen to be a major challenge for them in the short and medium term. So at least in the medium term, within the 10-year forecast, you can see here the top 4 green risks. All of them relate to either nature or climate-related events, and all of them are obviously going to be interconnected. So biodiversity shows up as number 3, and that is something that we have been seeing for quite a number of years now. So this is a real thing that businesses are facing right now, they will be facing in the longer term, in the medium term, and it's becoming everyone's reality and everyday reality. So if you can move to the next slide, please. We're starting to see the examples of the industries actually experiencing this. And Oxford Environmental Change Institute has done some research and has suggested that shocks to the economy due to biodiversity loss specifically could cost upwards 5 trillion. So that's a lot of zeros, but a number of different sectors are already seeing this effect and this impact. So obviously global food system probably would be the obvious one, but you might be familiar with the impacts in the travel sector. Ski sector is seeing a lot of the changes due to climate change events and ultimately this ecosystem shift. Transportation and supply chains, lots of now canals and shipping routes have been affected because the water levels are just not what they need to be. And we also seen impacts in digital infrastructure, which sometimes may be surprising for some people, but water is a massive contributor to that industry being efficient and effective. And in the water scarcity area, water scarcity risk, that means costs, interruptions, and business resilience actually being affected. But procurement can do a lot. So if you can move to the next slide, please, we can just have a look at a number of examples. Ross has talked to us about the 5 drivers of biodiversity loss, but an important thing to remember is they do have an order of precedence, an order of importance. So the first biggest contributor of biodiversity loss is actually habitat loss and fragmentation. And Ross has explained what that means, but if you think about what procurement teams can do, we actually can use the levers within the supply chain procurement processes to address those. So some examples would be having supply chain traceability. We want to know where are the materials coming from, and therefore which habitats actually being affected and to what extent. And the transparency aspect of this is the most important one to make a start. We can also have zero deforestation sourcing policy. A number of critical materials that can be linked to deforestation are well known and documented, so that can be a strong starting point to actually specify that we do not want to be linked to any of those kind of risks. And a number of other ways, but actually circularity will be something that will feature quite heavily in a number of conversations today, and probably sort of in wider sense as well. But using refurbished, reused products and drawing less virgin materials from the system of any nature would be a really strong approach. If you can click a couple of more times, please, Will, we can also see the other areas of impact and maybe a couple more. And so for the other aspects of the biodiversity drivers, we also have quite a few different tools accessible to us. So circularity, as I mentioned, vegan inputs, recycled content inputs, avoiding certain types of inputs and maybe specifying that we're not looking for scarce materials or wild harvested materials and inputs, for example, because all of them will have various impacts. Climate change and carbon might be something that you're very familiar with, so specifying lower carbon products, working with the suppliers around quantifying and measuring the footprint and supporting them with that, and actually just even working with the suppliers, so encouraging or supporting them, depending on your ability, is to set science-based targets, also means everybody's aligned around the same issues. If you can click a couple of more times, please, Will. We have sort of the other ones, and I just wanted to draw your attention to the invasive alien species, because this one very often feels like really removed from supply chain procurement and something really specific to something when we actually deal with the particular wildlife or maybe flora and fauna. But actually, if you think about your shipping routes, that's one of the really important contributors to invasive alien species introduction. When a ship docks and it takes the water in as a ballast, and then it drops off that ballast in a different port at the destination, then we are introducing the different microorganisms, different species, different wildlife from one water body to the other water body, from one ecosystem to the other ecosystem, and that's going to have very serious consequences. So one simple thing procurement can do is specify ballast water treatment standard for shipping partners, and those exist and they have been defined. So there's a number of levers that can be applied for that. If you can move us along, Will, please. I just wanted to share an example from our work in terms of how we have applied the biodiversity loss and risk screening. So, for example, here to identify negative impacts, we started off with measuring GHG of the ingredients. This is a cosmetics brand. And then from that list, we've identified the top 20 and did the screening against the biodiversity loss drivers, and actually figured out that a large chunk of these ingredients are also linked to deforestation potentially, because they are palm oil derived and we don't have traceability to make sure that there is no risk. Therefore, the risk exists. And so what can procurement do? Procurement can then issue supplier requests, which is what they've done, to get better visibility, traceability where it is possible and available, and get the confirmation that in fact there is no deforestation and what certifications might be supportive of that. But then ultimately also working with the product to start trying to substitute these ingredients that may be at risk and also high carbon with lower carbon and deforestation risk-free ingredients. And those innovative solutions do exist. Will, if you can click once again, I can show another example where an opportunity might be identified through a similar type of approach. So in this particular example, it's a consumer good brand, and we were looking at the low carbon cooking fuel alternatives. So think about biomass and pellets and woods and gas and things like that. So what else might exist that we can actually start reducing the environmental footprint? But we've also applied the nature risk screen to this, and I've identified that actually in the areas where biomass is still a preferred fuel for cooking, for various reasons that might still be the case, if you utilize the invasive species trees in that particular region, you're still getting your biomass quality and you're still getting the cooking fuel, but you're now actually addressing a problem in that particular region, and you're utilizing something that can be really, really harmful for the replacement of something that otherwise would have been utilized as well. And this procurement power comes in here as well in terms of commercial negotiations, identifying the right partners from the market and actually working out what that sort of balance would look like across the supply chain. So just a couple of examples of how it can actually be an opportunity, but also can be a risk depending on which way you're looking at supplier and procurement powers. Will, if you could just click once again, just to reiterate the point that I made, that I feel like supply chain and procurement actually have a lot of superpowers in this space and essentially are the gatekeepers of a lot of the solutions and implementation. And so just thinking about the levers that we have within the toolkit, needs assessment, supplier engagement, kind of going all the way through the list, but I've just suggested a few examples in terms of how those specific superpowers can actually help us address biodiversity loss drivers, so biodiversity loss, even where you might necessarily have data, because data on that kind of topic sometimes seems to feel like a barrier. So just an example around this, needs assessment, specifications, and evaluation of criteria would actually be probably your most powerful superpowers. First of all, because we want to start reducing consumption as much as possible where we can. So starting to think of different models of meeting the same requirements and functionalities. So shifting from ownership to access, shifting from ownership to rentals, and reusing and refurbishing the models, and kind of looking at innovative ways. Specification is super powerful because ultimately that's when you get to say what kind of partner you want to work with, what sort of parameters and requirements and environmental performance you're expecting to see. And evaluation criteria is ultimately where you're signaling in a very practical way that you value these impacts as much as you value the price, quality, and other components of value for money. And internalizing externalities is actually the most powerful way of aligning incentives. So for example, having a carbon price attached to how you're evaluating the commercials and the performance will also help you equalize. So value for money definition starts to shift a little bit from just simply quality and balance for financials. On that, if you can just move to the next slide, I just wanted to also highlight that actually within the space, there's quite a few different frameworks and regulations that can help you. So it might feel really daunting and a lot to absorb and kind of a new different language, but there's a lot of guidance that is already available. So within the UK, if you just even start thinking about the kind of regulations that are coming out, this timeline for the last few years gives you an idea that actually there's quite a few items that are available already. So UK Environment Act and UK Biodiversity Net Gain, the latter one being specifically applicable to sort of land-based and asset infrastructure. But if you think globally and if you think European legislation, there's quite a few that will mean that the change is being driven in the market. So if you're working with the suppliers across the board, they're probably already starting to do something. CSRD is probably the word and abbreviation you all have heard, or at least have started to deal with for some of you. And that's definitely going to be one piece of legislation that will not only start shifting the direction of travel in terms of how we address biodiversity within operations, but also provides quite a good guideline in terms of the kind of metrics that may be useful, the kind of approach and the toolkit that you might want to utilize. There's actually a lot of guidance within the document itself. So I do recommend, even if you don't have to deal with it immediately, do familiarize yourself with it and have a look at the toolkit that's provided. Interestingly enough, that's the one piece of legislation that does make a reference to planetary boundaries, which probably is the first time. So that's really important to also keep in mind. That's the concept around that. And the one piece to flag to you is that there is a Chinese equivalent of CSRD. It obviously is not called that, but it is Sustainability Reporting Disclosure, which is coming into force in 25. That's already been announced. And so what that means is that very often the supply chains are sitting in different countries and we kind of feel like we can't get transparency. But that just demonstrates to you that that is now going to be going across the board, and your conversations with the partners might become a little bit easier. We're going to be starting to speak the same language. And just to leave you with the final message before I close, if you can move us along, Will, please. I want to just remind us that business that delivers value for money, and the core concept of what procurement is there to safeguard, is business that profitably operates within the planetary boundaries and helps people thrive. These things have to go hand in hand. We sometimes do forget that, but that is the definition of value for money, especially in the context of what we have been discussing. So hopefully that can sort of help you rebalance a little bit how we are approaching this. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Emma.
Thanks, Marina. Hi, folks. So for those that joined late, my name is Emma Howcroft, and I work at Avantor Sciences. And I've actually been asked to come here to tell you how we've kicked off our nature journey. And I'd like to start off by saying we are quite early on in the journey and in no ways mature at all. But hopefully the way that we've approached it might provide some helpful tips. Next slide, Will. Great. So what I thought I'd start off by before sort of launching in is the difference between nature versus biodiversity. And Will very kindly sort of explain what biodiversity means. But I do think we use it interchangeably in sourcing and procurement. And I think that's probably what gets us a bit tongue-tied in the first place. So next sort of bit. Well, great. So funnily enough, people tend to say that if you're not focusing on nature, but the reality is, if you look at the words just there on the left in green, if your company is actually focusing on any of these one things or has targets in place, it is likely you are focusing on nature. So rest assured, you are doing it. What you're probably not doing it in your company is you're not packaging it up in a nature narrative. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. But from what you've heard of Marina and Ross, there is a question mark here, which is that should you be including biodiversity into your nature activities, and should you be calling it out? So based on the fact that diversity of life is essential for healthy nature, it does beg the question whether we should have species diversity targets in our overall nature efforts. The one thing I did want to explain was perhaps a slight sort of example. So if you're a chemicals company, and please assume this is sort of a imaginary chemicals company, and you have a water quality target, you publish it in your annual report every year, you're on track to meet your 2030 target, whatever that may be. And then you suddenly start to measure the diversity of life in the waterways that you impact, and you find that that's going down. What you might start to ask yourself is, should I have had a water quality target, or should I have had a species diversity target? And the reason for sort of giving you that example is, I think as procurement and sourcing professionals that have sort of high interaction with nature through the supply chain, we do need to start asking ourselves if we're focusing on the right things, we have the right narrative in place, and we have the right targets to make sure we're actually impacting change in a positive way. Next slide, Will. So, folks, we actually have a short poll on the side here, which is, have you already started to embed nature within your supply chain? So I thought before launching again, I would ask this question quickly just to see how mature everybody is today online. So if you haven't seen it, it's those funny three sort of, it's like a bar graph icon just on the right of your screen. So if everyone wants to sort of maybe have a vote. Not sure how long to give everyone, or if everyone's found it. It looks like that actually, if you actually look at your top left where it says poll. Okay, so shall we just see the results, folks? Hopefully everyone's found it. Okay. So I might have to ask the folks behind the scenes in case I'm not clicking forward on something. Okay, so sorry, folks. I think we may have had some technical difficulties there. We might come back to that. So, Will, I don't think we're seeing it our side. We've kind of got the options up on the screen, but we don't necessarily see the results. Let's scroll down, right? I am scrolling down. Okay. Well, let's move on, because unfortunately on my side of things, I can't see things. Sorry. I think the behind the scenes folks are trying to make this on. Well, but I think let's just move on in the interest of time. Sorry, folks. Slight technical issues there.
Slight technical issues behind the scenes. So, Will, let's go back on. Most people then, just to say, even though we can't actually put it on the screen, most people have got some ad hoc focus, but no company strategy or goals in place at this point of time. So that's the main majority of those who have answered.
Brilliant.
But thank you for participating in that. That's great. Okay.
Thanks, Jo. Brilliant. So I think it's interesting to hear people say ad hoc focus, because I would suspect that they probably are focusing on nature without realizing it. So this is the original image of our responsible supplier program. So I sit within our sustainable sourcing team, And my role is to put our sustainable sourcing strategy in place. And the mechanism by which we did this was launching our responsible supplier program, which was really to help our suppliers become more sustainable and obviously contribute to our sustainability efforts and targets. I'm not here to talk about the entire program, but what I did want to do was touch on why we focus on the things that we did, because I think it's important to understanding how one can incorporate nature into one's efforts. So we focused on climate change because we're a large manufacturing company, and therefore we have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and our suppliers have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're able to prove that point and get it included. We operate in Asia and also operate in industries that have high human rights risks. So we're able to evidence and explain why we should focus on human rights. We then kind of went on to different topics. And we have a lot of packaging. We distribute products all over the world. And so we knew that we would have a deforestation impact on the paper side and pallet side with wood. And also we've got lots of packaging in our supply chain. So we could make our packaging better. So that kind of ticks those two off. For water, we have a chemicals arm to our company, which means water quality and the potential to pollute. So it made sense for us to focus on water, and we had a narrative there. But when we actually looked at our suppliers and where they're based and looked at their water stress, for the most part, actually, we didn't have a huge amount of high water stress risk in our supply chain that we could see based on the data that we had of our suppliers. But we still thought we should focus on it, knowing that we work in the chemical industry, and we thought there will be a risk there, and obviously we need to take responsibility for that risk. And then in relation to waste, we decided to focus on waste because, again, we have lots of products going out because we work, we actually produce lots of products that end up in laboratories. Laboratories often have single-use mechanisms. It likely means a lot's being thrown away. And so we did an analysis of where our waste is going and the infrastructure, waste infrastructure in each country that our waste goes into, to understand potentially the risk of that waste ending up in the environment. And it was relatively high, so we included waste. Now, next slide, or next piece, brilliant. So why am I calling this all out? Well, really, those four that you see on the screen there are nature-related topics. We just didn't package it up as nature. And I think if we'd gone to our leadership team and said, we're going to focus on climate change, human rights, and nature, and had those four topics under our nature banner, I would have probably said we wouldn't have got it through. Because when you say the word nature, it sounds very big. People can't really understand how they impact it. And then the third issue is that when you say nature, people just think biodiversity, and it's not quite that. So the reason I wanted to call this out is there really is something to be said about how you position something and the narrative and the targets that you put in place to actually achieve change. Next slide. So we've been running our program a year now, and I think we've sort of increased in maturity, where this year, and this is pre-press, I would say, guys, so this is draft format, we're now going to go back and actually change our narrative and topic titles, which sounds like a small thing, but I'll explain why it's not small. So we're now going to suggest that we call deforestation and water and sort of change that into nature conservation. And what that will allow us to do is to evolve our sort of nature efforts, but also ensure that we can actually include biodiversity in the long term into our activities. And then we're actually going to condense responsible packaging and waste into resource circularity. And that will also allow us to include sort of product-related activity into our sort of resource circularity topics. Now, interestingly, if you're doing resource circularity, you are protecting nature, because then you're extracting less from nature. And I think anyone that starts to do this as a day job and focus on it a lot, you'll start to realize how interconnected all the different sustainability topics are. And so what we should really be thinking about in sourcing, considering we do have the opportunity to have a really big impact, is thinking about what is the narrative we need to get in place? What do we need to call things to get things signed off at a senior level? But also, what do we need to call things to actually help our suppliers on their way as well? And I think actually talking to suppliers about deforestation and water was an easier thing for them to get their heads around, rather than starting off with nature conservation, which sounds quite big. And if people don't have biodiversity in their strategy, it often doesn't resonate with them. So we're going to be doing a lot of capacity building, as you can see, and we're going to be doing it across all 2 topics there in the future. And what you'll notice there is we're going to do more target setting for resource circularity, because people tend to understand those concepts better than they do nature conservation. So we're really going to focus just on capacity building on the nature side for now. I'm conscious of time, Joe, so I was actually going to stop there. Okay, great, folks. And we'll head over to questions.
Perfect, thank you. It's good to be back in. First of all, thank you, all 3 of you. Fantastic insights, and I think we're going to need to have follow-up sessions with each of you, certainly within the UK chapter or whatever, because there is so much information and discussion we can have. Very conscious of the time schedule that we've got this morning. So we've just got a few questions that we've been asked already that I'm just going to raise. First of all, to Emma. It's fantastic to hear the progress that you've already been making on your journey at Avantor. Is there anything else that's useful that you haven't mentioned at the moment that you just want to flag for 2 minutes? Because you did just stop.
I did. Thank you. And Will, I do have a slide. I don't know if you can pull it up just in case you can get it quickly. But I think we're literally progressing our let's call it nature journey. So one of the things that we're going to be doing this year as well is actually looking at our trading code. So if you go to your regulatory teams and you ask them for their trading codes, what you can do is you can look at all the products that you sell, use the EU trading codes to sort of create some assumptions and start to look at your potential nature and biodiversity risk using regulatory data, in short, which I think is a good tip for folks if you don't know where to start first. And there are lots of other good tips out there. But because we were new to this and we recognised it was a sort of immature area for us, we actually got together with some other wonderful folks that you see on the screen there to actually create the Nature Steward Alliance. And this is another thing that I think sourcing and procurement folks can do is don't do it alone. Join other sort of peer groups that actually understand what others are doing in this space. And if there isn't a peer group that's going to support what you need, maybe get together with some others and actually create their own. So this particular peer group is really about trying to actually create tools for the supply chain so that suppliers can get started on their nature journey before sort of big SBTN and TNFD requirements come down the chain or come up the chain, so to speak. I'll stop there, but thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's been a great question which has been raised by Sagar this morning, which is again, see that companies that have a strong focus on climate, decarbonisation, renewable energy and stuff, how do we actually manage to embed nature into the organisational strategy and get it there and give it equal focus? Marina, do you have a view with regard to that and getting it actually up there on the organisation strategy?
Thank you. I think I'll kickstart, and I'm sure if you also have something to add. I think the starting point is actually understanding where your interfaces with nature are across the operations, and those interfaces may be in unexpected places in some cases, but just understanding where they are in terms of your activities, but also physically, where are they? Because it's really important to understand not just we are utilizing water, but are we utilizing water from water scarce resources? Are we utilizing timber or any kind of minerals from areas which then may be associated with additional risks? So it's really important to have a location there in mind, and then looking whether it's a dependency for your business or whether it's something that you're contributing towards. That's also going to be a really important aspect. So kind of how is that interface working for the business and what sort of implications might there be? I think starting with that would be a really good idea, so understanding what nature is and where you're engaging with that, and from there moving along that sort of priority chain in terms of risks, impacts and opportunities.
Brilliant, thank you. Emma, did you have anything else that you wanted to chip in, or Ross, on that one at all?
I mean, sorry, you go, Emma.
Go Ross. No, go on, Ross.
I think just building on, obviously there are certain elements around kind of biodiversity and nature that there is kind of statutory compliance as well, and I think that's potentially kind of a good starting point to then build it. Where can you go beyond that? And it's interesting, especially in the UK, or I say England, I should say actually, and hopefully other bits of the UK soon. When we look at more sort of construction, there are things like biodiversity net gain as well, which is a real kind of new thing and an area of kind of innovation and something you can really build into what you do if you're in that kind of sector. Looking at how can you work with organisations to achieve biodiversity net gain, which is now a legal requirement as well. Understanding what habitats might be actually on some where you're working, and then kind of looking at, once you finish the project, looking at having to achieve that 10%. It's a really big thing. Again, a little bit specialised in terms of sector, but a really good starting point.
Brilliant. And Ross, just on that, in terms of starting points and things, a lot of us within our procurement teams are thinking about capacity building. Is there any specific training or links that you've got in terms of things that you would recommend people look at or go further if they want to know more about nature and biodiversity?
I mean, obviously, yeah, I'm slightly biased maybe, but we run the supply chain sustainability school. So essentially, it's again, it does have a construction focus, but a lot of the resources that we have been written in a way that they are relevant cross-sector as well. But we have, you know, I think we've got 200 free e-learning modules on our website across a real range of sustainability topics. Biodiversity is in there as one, and we're really focusing on things like, you know, nature-based solutions, which is another thing. Again, it's a bit construction focused, but really interesting, what, you know, trying to use nature as to solve some of the problems you might have on a construction site, if you're looking at drainage or looking at kind of you know, kind of even making sites look better and that kind of thing as well. So yes, there's a lot of free resources out there. Supply chain school is a good area where you can start to understand you know, areas of knowledge you might want to kind of build. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, Ross, maybe you could just put the link for that in the chat for us, if you could, for anybody who hasn't come across that. It is a fantastic resource, I have to say. Marina, any quick
Just maybe to add that outside of the sector, maybe sector agnostic, we run something called Biodiversity Collage, which introduces the concepts and the basics of how the ecosystems and biodiversity interact and what it means for business. So it's a good starter to get you language, to get you understanding before you start doing deep dives in terms of functional and industry specifics.
Brilliant. And again, if you can just put that if there's any link or anything in there, let's put it in the chat quickly that we can do. Conscious of time, everybody, I've got one final question to ask for a very quick fire sort of bit. We clearly need more sessions talking about nature and diversity. Thank you to everybody who's actually done those questions. But one I just want to ask each of you, if I can, is if there is one key takeaway from this morning that you want to pass on and leave to everybody who has joined, which we've got so many people who have dialed in this morning to listen to you all, which is fantastic. What key takeaway would you give to our procurement professionals when thinking about nature and biodiversity in the supply chains that they have? What's one point that you've got? Marina, should I come to you first? Oh, you're on mute.
It's working. Sorry, technical. So I think the one takeaway is that biodiversity in supply chains is similar to carbon, but also really different. So 1 ton of carbon is the same whether it's going to be in the UK or in Indonesia, whereas 1 liter of water or soil is not going to be the same in Indonesia and the UK. So it's really important to take the context into account and have that understanding in terms of the location risks and what it means for the local ecosystem. So start looking at the location aspects as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Ross?
I think I'm going to be greedy and say kind of 2, but they are connected. So I think the first thing is about, you know, just the interconnectedness of everything. You know, everything that we buy has an impact, and there will be kind of some element of biodiversity impact in there somewhere. And just going back to what Marina said, you know, kind of really deep dive and understand where that is. And then I would say, building on that is, you know, being efficient and trying to kind of consume as little virgin resources as you can, and looking to kind of, can you look for circularity and recycled materials, and really trying to kind of reduce consumption to a minimum is going to help loads in minimizing impacts to biodiversity.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Emma, over to you. What's one key takeaway you can leave people with?
I think as sourcing and procurement folk, it's quite difficult, because if you work in the manufacturing space and you're producing products, it is likely you will have a high biodiversity risk, but you might not have a high biodiversity risk within your corporate four walls. And so your corporate sustainability team isn't going to push it. So I would say you potentially have a responsibility within your sourcing teams to understand what that risk is by using secondary data. And there's lots out there, guys, so do train yourselves up. Or potentially, as Ross just said, focusing on statutory requirements like regulation to be able to showcase the fact that this is coming and people are going to be asked to focus on it, and you can get ahead of the game. So that would be my advice.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We are going to have to wrap that up now. It's gone so quickly. We clearly need to talk so much more about this. Emma, Marina, Ross, thank you so much for your time this morning. Thank you to Will behind the scenes as well for all of his technical side of things and the core team, but most of all also to every one of you who've taken the time this morning to join in and to participate and to listen to this hour's session. I hope there are so many more sessions today. I really hope that everybody has a fantastic day. This recording will be available for the next 2 weeks post this session. We will also, there are comments and chats. We are going to take some time and respond. There are some resources there, which Marina has kindly provided. We've put some links in. Take a moment. That should still be available after this session as well. But for now, thank you all. Go grab a quick coffee or have a quick break before the next session. I think you've got the scheduled 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Bye.